Hello, and welcome to Grow a Traditional Medicinal Herb Garden. I'm Kathryn Kellam, and I'm an Extension Master Gardener in Alexandria. And with me today are three of my colleagues, Denise Landers, Amanda Gordon, and Susan Wilhelm. And you'll hear from all four of us over the course of today's program. As members of Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia, we're volunteers with the Virginia Cooperative Extension, serving Arlington County and the city of Alexandria. And our role is to provide public education on environmentally sound gardening practices. We do that in a variety of different ways. We often offer classes like this throughout the year, free to the public. We also have a help desk that runs year-round to help you with your gardening questions and gardening problems. Currently, our help desk is being staffed remotely, and so the best way to reach us is through email. Our email address is mgarlex@gmail.com, or you can go to our website, mgnv.org, and follow the links to send us an email there. Now, typically this time of year, we also have plant clinics running at some of the local farmers markets and activities and educational events in our demonstration gardens, but those are currently suspended. If you watch our website or sign up for one of our newsletters, you'll be able to see when we're able to resume those activities. And by the way, when you go to our website, I would strongly encourage you to spend some time looking around there. There are amazing resources that are really at your fingertips there, just a click away. And you'll hear a little bit more about that later on from Susan. Now let's take a look at our agenda. We're going to start out by defining exactly what we mean by an herb. And we're going to look at some of the historical uses of herbs for medicine. Then I'm going to offer you some ideas for making good selections for herbs for your own garden. And I'm going to hand things off to Denise and Amanda to really drill deeply into our 14 featured herbs. Susan is going to share some tips on preserving the herbs that you harvest from your garden, and she's also going to share some best practices for growing those herbs successfully in your garden. So what is an herb? Well, that really depends on who you ask. If you ask a botanist, she's going to say an herb is a non-woody plant, meaning it's a plant with soft stems instead of hard woody stems. And that is technically correct. But if you ask a member of the general public what an herb is, you're going to get a broad array of answers. Some people will talk about medicinal uses like we're talking about today, or cosmetic uses. You'll often hear people talk about herbs are used to flavor food or for nutrients, or they have a beautiful fragrance in the garden like lavender, or they're useful for crafts or dyes. Basically, it comes down to an herb is a useful plant. And that's the definition that we're using today for this class and also for our other programs on herbs. So let's drill into some of the historical uses for herbs as medicine. Now, one of the things we know today is that every culture around the planet that uses plants for food also has a history of using plants for medicine. And today, with the amazing technology and tools that our scientists have, including archaeologists, we're learning some amazing things from deep in history. In 2017, a study was published looking at the ancient remains, not of our human ancestors, Homo sapiens, but of our human cousins, the Neanderthals. And the most interesting finding from that study from an herbal perspective was of an adolescent male Neanderthal who died 48,000 years ago. And his teeth showed that he had had a terrible abscess at the time that he died. He would have been in a lot of pain. A microscopic analysis of the tartar on his teeth showed that he also had a bacterium in his system that would have given him a very severe stomach bug. So he was also a very sick young man. But that microscopic analysis of the tartar also showed that he was self-medicating. He had been chewing the bark of a poplar tree, which contains salicylic acid, basically a natural form of aspirin. He also had been eating penicillium, which is the mold that produces penicillin. So 48,000 years ago, an adolescent Neanderthal male was self-medicating with aspirin and an antibiotic. How does that even happen? How is that possible? Well, the most obvious connection is through food. Plants are basically little chemical factories. An individual plant has at least hundreds, and in many cases, thousands of different chemicals in it. We don't even know what those chemicals are, much less what they do. But we do know they interact inside plants in very complex ways. And it's a good possibility that when we eat them, they interact inside our bodies in very complex ways. So if you think back to 48,000 years ago, or 75,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, the people of that time were probably eating a much more diverse array of plants than we are today. And when occasionally they ate a plant that produced a really positive response for them, that was very valuable information. That was knowledge they wanted to hold on to and an event they wanted to be able to replicate. So whether it was something very specific, like eating the bark of a particular tree and that relieves pain that you're feeling, or eating something that has a particular mold growing on it and that nasty infection improves, that's really valuable knowledge. It could also be something more general. Whenever you eat that plant, you feel better. Something about your body improves. That could be a plant that has nutrients or micronutrients that you need, but are very rare in your environment. But for you, your family, your community, your culture, that is really important knowledge that you're going to want to hang on to and share and keep going through the generations. Eventually, as those cultures became more sophisticated, that knowledge was systematized. And more importantly, when they developed writing, it was documented. And that's the point when that ancient culture leaves prehistory and becomes part of recorded history. And that's what we benefit from today. In ancient Greece, we're all familiar with Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath, but Hippocrates did more than that. Hippocrates systematized the practice, the clinical practice of medicine, and that reverberates throughout Western culture today. In other parts of the globe, there's traditional Chinese medicine, there's Ayurvedic medicine in India, and Native Americans populated 2 entire continents with many systems of medicine based on their plants, some of which blessedly was documented and we still benefit from today. So plants as complex chemical factories provide a source of medicine that's really important to us. But as we all know, every coin has 2 sides. And the other side of that is that not all plants are our friends. We urge you to exercise caution anytime you're considering doing anything with an unfamiliar plant. And we're going to expand that and say, also exercise caution when you're considering using familiar plants in new ways. We have a tendency, I think, especially in the West, to want to think that when something is natural, like a plant, it's also safe. But that's not always the case. And an easy example is poison ivy. Poison ivy is a plant that punishes you just for touching it. But there are other plants that are probably familiar to you. They may be growing in your garden. You value them, and so you think of them as safe. But they probably come with some risk. For instance, if you grow plants for flowers, there's a good chance that you have foxgloves in your garden. They have gorgeous flowers. But foxgloves also produce digitalis, which does have medicinal purposes, but is fatal, even in small doses. And in the vegetable garden, one of the easiest and most fun plants to grow is the potato. But the only part of the potato that is not toxic is those tubers that we dig up and harvest. So I share this with you, not to scare you, not to frighten you, but really to impress upon you the importance of exercising caution with plants. That chemical complexity of plants can lead to tissue irritation, like with poison ivy. It can also spark allergies. Some plants contain latex, which a lot of people are allergic to, but there are other allergens out there. You may have people in your world, family members, friends, who rave about a particular herb and how wonderful it is, and it may be for them. But you could have an underlying health condition that makes it a bad choice for you, or it might not mix safely with medications that you're taking. And then there's the issue of dose-dependent toxicity. In other words, a little bit might be just fine and might even be good, but more could be risky or even dangerous. So when you think about plants, remember chemical complexity, and remember they're not always our friends. What we all need to do is be prepared to do our own research and not rely on the research of others. And the way to start is by correctly identifying the plant. And that's through its Latin name, not its common name. And I'll give you an example. In a few minutes, Denise is going to share information with you on a plant called the marshmallow. Now, you don't want to go on Google and type in marshmallow safety. For one thing, you're just going to get a lot of weird stuff about marshmallows, but also there are a lot of different mallow plants out there. And who knows what someone on the internet is calling the marshmallow. It might be a completely different plant than the one that you're interested in. So what you want to do is use its Latin name, which is Althea officinalis. That's the name you want to give to your doctor. That's the name you want to give to your pharmacist. That's the name you want to give to any healthcare provider you're working with, and let them see what they have in their database that could tie that plant to your health conditions or to the medications that you're taking. And when you go online to do your own research, you type in Althea officinalis safety, and then you type site, SITE, :edu. That will only bring back results from universities and colleges, basically educational institutions, and you will get a much better set of findings than you would from the internet overall. Or you type in site::gov. That will only bring back results from governmental organizations like the Food and Drug Administration or the National Institutes of Health. So by doing these two simple things, sticking to the Latin name of the plant and doing very carefully filtered searches, you can supplement what you learn from your doctor and your pharmacist in terms of the suitability of a particular herb for you. That's really important in terms of decision making. Now, fortunately, there are other things that we also want to consider in terms of deciding what herbs are best for our garden, and these are more fun to think about. So when someone asks us as master gardeners what they should grow, the first answer we give them is grow what you like. We want you to enjoy your garden. And one of the best places to start when you're figuring out what you want for your garden is what purpose you want that plant to serve there. Now, the fact that you're attending a program on medicinal herbs means that medicinal properties may be a purpose that you want some of your plants to serve, but there may be other things as well. Again, flavor and nutrients, very common as part of choosing herbs for the garden, but also fragrance, dyes. And you might want to think a little more broadly and think about wildlife. Do you want to include plants that are great for birds or maybe host for local butterflies? All of those are great purposes that plants can serve in your garden. Then think about things from the plant's perspective. Are the plants that you're considering really suitable for our area? And normally when we talk about this, we are thinking about the fact that we're zone 7, and this has to do with how cold our winters get here. But we also have hot and humid summers. We have heavy rains and flooding. We have periods of drought. We have heavy clay soils that can be acidic. All of those affect how suitable a plant would be for our area here. And specifically, is a plant tender or hardy here? Now, again, this typically has to do with how cold our winters get, but the fact is there's some plants that'll do fine in our winters, but they won't survive our hot and humid summers. So you want to take that into account. And then how big does that plant get? Is it suitable? Will it fit that space in the garden where you want it to be? Do you want to have a plant that really supports beneficial insect life? That's awesome for the environment, but it's also really important just for the health of your own garden. And what about aesthetics? Do you want something that's beautiful in the garden? Do you want a particular shade of green, a beautiful plant structure, a certain flower color, fragrance, whatever it is that will make you smile when you experience that plant in the garden? That is a perfectly good reason to choose that plant for your garden. Do you like growing plants from seed? There are lots of plants you can have. If you grow them from seed, it really broadens the variety of plants you can have in your garden. But maybe also you're someone who just wants to buy the baby plant and transplant it in, and that gets you started a little faster as well. And finally, what kind of relationship do you want to have with plants? Do you want a long-term commitment or a short-term commitment? If you want a short-term commitment, annuals or biennials may be better choices for you. A long-term commitment is more of a perennial type plant. And let's take a look and see exactly what I mean by that terminology. Annual plants are plants that live their entire life in a single growing season. They germinate from seed, they mature into a plant, they send up their flowers, they develop their seeds and release those, and that's the next generation, and then they die. And a great example of an annual plant is the pot marigold. This is one that we'll be looking at today. The other type of plant that's similar is a biennial plant, and it has the same kind of lifespan, but it's spread over 2 years. So the first year, the seed germinates and the plant matures, and then it winters over. And the next year, it sends up its flowers, it produces its seeds, and it dies. An example of a biennial plant is the hollyhock. Those are short-term relationship plants, and they offer the possibility of variety, of basically flexibility, mixing up your garden from year to year. But perennial plants offer stability and permanence. You plant them once and they come back year after year. And if that's of interest to you, then you might want to consider the marshmallow that you see here in the pale purple. And finally, there's such a thing as a tender perennial, which is perennial in its native environment, but it won't survive our cold winters. However, there are tender perennials that do well in containers, and so they can be safely wintered over, and we can enjoy them here. An example of one of those from today's program is ginger. So think about all these different characteristics of plants that I've mentioned, and think about what's important to you and what's attractive to you in terms of selecting plants for your garden. And then let's take a look at the 14 herbs that are going to be included in today's program. As you look at this nice table that Amanda put together, you'll see it's organized according to preferred growing conditions, the amount of sun and the amount of moisture that these plants prefer. And if you look right in the middle of the table, you'll see that 7 of the 14 plants really do their best in full sun with average moisture. There are a couple that like a more moist environment, and there are 4 that like dry conditions. And then we have 2 that really do best in part sun rather than full sun. Now, as you look at the names of these plants, you're going to see that some of them look familiar, and undoubtedly some of them don't look very familiar, and that's intentional. For one thing, these plants were chosen to represent not one traditional culture, but a variety of traditional cultures from all over the world. So there are plants from Europe, from the Mediterranean, Africa, Asia, plants from colonial America and Native American cultures. Also, there are plants here that you probably recognize from your own spice cabinet. There's thyme and sage, garlic, ginger, and turmeric. And then some you may recognize from your flower garden. Candy tuft, hollyhocks, pot marigold, and coneflower are all very popular ornamentals. Three that are probably not familiar to you are that marshmallow that I keep talking about, also rose roots, and something called a house leek. And then finally, we have one shrub, the elderberry, and one so-called weed, the dandelion. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand things off to Denise to begin drilling into our 14 medicinal herbs. And she is going to begin with the common thyme.
Thank you, Kathryn. Common thyme is a low-growing perennial with small gray-green aromatic leaves and fragrant pale lilac blooms. It grows in about 1 foot high and wide, and it's a perennial that's hardy in zones 5 to 9. It was originally native to the Mediterranean, so it grows well in full sun and medium to dry, well-drained soil. Historically, thyme was used as a nervous curative and antiseptic as relief for gastric upset, bronchial, and throat conditions. Interestingly, its name comes from the Greek, which means smoke, and it was used in temples to honor the gods and was thought to dispel insects and contagion. The ancient Egyptians used thyme to embalm, and Romans slept on it to ease melancholy. More modern research supports that thyme is a strong antiseptic. It can fight infections of all kinds, and it's particularly helpful with respiratory, digestive, and urinary tract system issues. It also has antibiotic, antifungal, and antispasmodic effects, so it does help in instances to relieve asthma and coughs. And also in a liniment, it is helpful for aching joints and as a gargle for sore throats. The parts used are the leaf and flowers. And in terms of harvesting, you can harvest thyme throughout the season. And it's best, though, when picking the leaves to do that in the morning or just before the time of year before the flowers open. And then you want to dry things quickly. The leaves and flowers can also be distilled into an oil or dry, in addition to being dried, and of course can be used fresh. Things that are good to know about thyme is it is highly tolerant of rocky soil and drought. It does have a tendency to grow woody, so it's recommended that you cut it back at least annually in the spring. You may also want to do that in the fall to promote bushy growth. It is a fast grower, and it is a wonderful attractant to bees and other pollinators. And it can be started from seed or may also be propagated from stem cuttings or by division. The next featured herb is sage. And sage is an evergreen that has square stems and velvety gray, green, and purple leaves. It flowers also in the early summer. It's a bit larger plant. It can grow up to 2.5 feet in dimension. And it's a perennial that is hardy in zones 5 to 8. Sage also hails from the Mediterranean region, so it grows well in full sun with dry to medium well-drained soil. Historically, sage was also was considered an astringent and an antiseptic. It was used for ulcers and sores in the mouth and throat and wounds, and as a digestive aid and nervous tonic. The ancient Greeks actually used sage to cure many ills, and the Egyptians relied upon it to treat the plague. And the Romans ascribed such substantial healing properties that it was part of the official pharmacopoeia, and it was particularly known as a digestive aid that helped in fat digestion and with liver health. And modern research does support that sage possesses antibacterial and antifungal and astringent properties. Some studies show that It has anti-inflammatory effects and so helps gum disease. And have been several small-scale studies on humans that support that sage has mood and cognitive benefits and has improved memory function in early stage Alzheimer's. It's also helpful externally on wounds, burns, and sores. The parts used are the leaves. And in terms of harvesting, this plant can be harvested throughout the year. The leaves do tend to be most flavorful in summertime before the plant blooms. And again, you need to dry it quickly, and the leaves also may be boiled or soaked. It is also tolerant of rocky soil and drought, and it has a similar tendency to get woody, so it's recommended that you cut it back at least in the springtime, if not twice a year. And it does grow from seed or cuttings. And similar to thyme, because of this woody habit, it's likely you would have to replace the plant in 4 years or 5 years or so. The next featured herb is the elderberry. This is a deciduous shrub with fragrant cream flowers and blue-black berries. It can grow from 5 to 12 feet high and similarly in width. It's a perennial, and it is native to Europe, and it likes full sun to part shade and moist soil, but the soil must drain well. Historically, it was used to relieve headaches, bruises, burns, and boils, and as a diuretic for fevers, colds, and flu. In Europe, it was termed the medicine chest of country folk. The elder plant has long been held in esteem for its beneficial and curative qualities, and its name and the old world tradition of planting it at the edge of a garden as a protector denotes its status. Native Americans also found many uses for every part of the elder plant as food, dye, in basketry, tools, and musical instruments, and then medicinally, they relied on it to heal cuts, bruises, burns, and as a diuretic. And the elderflower tea was used for fevers and colds. More recently, small-scale studies do support that elderberries boost the immune system and they can reduce the severity of colds. Flower tops improve circulation and so causes sweating, which can alleviate fevers. And it also acts as a diuretic and can be helpful. The berries in particular have been shown to reduce upper respiratory issues that come from infections and congestion. The parts used are the flowers and the berries. And in terms of harvesting, you would collect the flowers while they're in bloom, which is typically June to August. The berries can be harvested thereafter, as early as July through the fall. And with elderberry, you must cook the berries or any part of the plant that you use. Otherwise, it can have an adverse effect such as nausea if ingested. Things that are good to know about elderberries is its flowers and its berries attract numerous wildlife and pollinators. It is easy to grow. Its roots are shallow and sends up canes similar to raspberries, but as a result, it promotes ground cover, which can be very helpful for erosion control. And if you are planting it, it's helpful to plant 2 cultivars within 60 feet of each other. That way it promotes pollination and fruiting. And it self-seeds, and it can also be propagated through wood cuttings. Our next featured herb is the coneflower. This is a lovely perennial that grows wild in many parts of North America. It has upright stems and pink to purple daisy-like flowers. It can stand as tall as 5 feet and span 2 feet wide. It's a perennial from zones 3 to 8, and it enjoys full sun and rich sandy soil, but it is a hardy grower and it can thrive in just about any soil condition. Historically, the coneflower was used for external wounds, burns and bites, colds, coughs, and allergies, and stomach cramps. The Native Americans had discovered its benefits, and it was quite an important medicine to them. It was used by the Indians as a local anesthetic for toothaches, headaches, stomach pain, as an antidote for snake bites, and it would help fight infections related to coughs, colds, and abscesses. It also, the roots of the coneflower stimulate saliva production, and the Cheyenne would chew the root in preparation for their sun dance ritual. And the Sioux took it for rabies and snake bites. Today, the coneflower is studied for its antibacterial, anti-infection, and antifungal properties and shows signs of stimulating the immune system in response to colds and flus and respiratory infections. And studies have also shown that it evidences wound healing properties. With respect to harvest, the parts that are used is the roots and flowers primarily, although the leaves may also be used. And in terms of harvesting, you would want to collect the flowers while in bloom, as well as the leaves, which is most of the summer, June to August. With respect to roots or rhizomes, you should pull those plants in the autumn, and it should be a 4-year-old plant at least. And in terms of just in general, coneflowers are threatened in the wild, so you don't want to ever go picking anything out growing naturally. You'd want to work with commercially grown plants. This is native to central United States. It is grown from seed in the spring, and it can be its roots can be divided in the winter. And one nice aside about this plant is that its name comes from the Greek echinos, which means hedgehog, and it's actually in reference to the beautiful black shiny seed head in the middle of the flower. Next is the dandelion. This is a perennial that grows up to a foot tall. It has ragged basal leaves and bright yellow flowers. It is typically smaller, up to 8 inches high and 6 inches wide, perennial in zones 5 to 10, and it is a plant that likes full sun to part shade and average soil conditions. Historically, its leaves were used as a diuretic, and the roots were used to support liver and gallbladder and kidney functions as a detoxifier. It derives its name from the French, which means teeth of a lion, because its leaves were thought to resemble the lion's jaw. And of note, the number of incisions on the leaves actually corresponds to the amount of sunlight that the plant gets. So the sunnier the spot, the more deeply toothed the basal leaves are. Dandelion was valued in ancient times as an antidote for poisons and rheumatism, and the leaves were traditionally eaten in the spring as a cleansing tonic since they acted as a diuretic. The spring leaves of a dandelion are also highly nutritious, and the roasted roots were drank much like coffee is today. Based on small-scale studies, the leaves are still considered to be an effective mild diuretic that is also high in potassium. So while it stimulates elimination of fluids, you do not lose potassium in the process. Dandelion root is also a detoxifier that stimulates the liver and gallbladder and aids in systemic conditions such as eczema or arthritic issues, where improved clearance of toxins reduces local inflammation. The parts used typically are the leaves and the roots, although the flowers may also be used. And in terms of harvesting, the leaves are collected in early spring, usually for tonics and salads when they're less bitter. The roots are harvested in autumn from second-year plants and dried. And then the flowers may be used for wine. So in this respect, actually, dandelion is an interesting plant because you could consider it an annual for its flowers, a biennial for its roots, and a perennial if you're growing it for its leaves. Pollinators are strongly attracted to the dandelion flower. It grows wildly in many parts of the United States, adapts well to soil and light conditions, and its seeds spread easily from its spent flowers and can easily be propagated by barely covering the seeds in moist soil. The next featured herb is the marshmallow. This is a stately perennial that is tall and slender with heart-shaped leaves and pink flowers. It grows up to 6 feet tall. It is hardy in zones 3 to 9 and typically blooms in July through September of the second year. It enjoys full sun to part shade and wet soil or marshland. Its historical use was for sore throats, as an expectorant and digestive aid. And in fact, the French in the 1700s used to whip the gummy roots of the marshmallow plant with sugar and eggs and made a light confection, and it would soothe the coughs and calm the digestion of babies. The marshmallow candy got its name from the plant because it was the mucilage in the mallow root that was used in the original recipe. Roots and leaves in tea were used to soothe sore throats, as an expectorant and for digestive irritations, including ulcers, and poultices of marshmallow have been used to heal sprains, bruises, and to soothe skin irritations. And it's the mucilage in the marshmallow root that is wonderfully soothing. Modern small-scale studies indicate that it has many of the same benefits, antibacterial, anti-cough, antiviral, that the root was often used for historically. The syrup eases coughs and can soothe sore throats, inflamed gums, and reduces respiratory infections. It similarly can aid gastric ulcers, eczema, and heal wounds. The parts used are the roots, leaves, and flowers. The aerial parts in terms of harvesting should be gathered in the summer at the beginning of flowering. And the roots are harvested in autumn from plants that are at least 3 years old. It is native to Europe but has been well established and so is naturalized in the US. It actually thrives in marshy fields, loamy soil, and wetland and tidal areas, but this is not a plant that is drought tolerant. It can be grown from seed or divided by its roots in the spring and fall. And it's the mucilage in the root that is has the medicinal qualities. And this plant's related to the hollyhock. Finally, we have calendula or pot marigold. This is an annual with bright orange and yellow daisy-like flowers. It can grow up to 2 feet high and wide. It's perennial in zones 2 through 11. And it enjoys full sun to part shade and grows readily and flourishes in many types of soil. Historically, pot marigold was used generally as an anti-inflammatory to soothe skin, wounds, acne, rashes, and mouth sores, and it was considered to have antifungal properties. Romans used calendula to reduce fevers, and in the medieval period, it was used for intestinal problems and liver complaints. It was popular in Shakespeare's time as a versatile remedy for skin issues, wounds, burns, rashes, and other inflammations. And the Shakers used it for gangrene. Today, our understanding of pot marigold is that it has astringent and antiseptic qualities. It has been shown to have significant activity against the fungus that causes thrush, and its astringency makes it an effective in staunching wounds. So it is considered a powerful aid for many minor skin conditions such as rashes, burns, sunburn, and it has an anti-inflammatory quality that speeds healing. The parts used are the flowers, and typically you harvest them in the early summer as they open, and then you would want to dry them in the shade. This is a plant that was native to Southern Europe and cultivated in temperate regions. So it actually can languish in the high heat of summer. The plant can often grow weedy, and so you can either cut it back at that time and it will bloom again, or this is the type of plant, because it does tolerate frost in the fall, you can reseed it and you would get a second round of blooms. This plant is different though from the traditional marigold. And it is a plant that grows readily from seed, and it has a wild species that has very similar medicinal qualities. So now I'd like to turn this over to Amanda, who will discuss some more featured herbs.
Thank you, Denise. I'm going to start with 3 herbs that y'all are probably familiar with from cooking. The first one is garlic. Garlic is a member of the onion family. It is native to Central Asia and northeastern Iran. And you may be familiar with some of the legends around garlic, most of which have to do with it fortifying us in some way. For example, some people believe that eating garlic will ward off vampires. And those kind of traditions have been around for a long time. In fact, Roman soldiers ate garlic before battle because they believed it provided courage. As far as historical medicinal uses, the most common traditional uses were as an antiseptic and also were diuretic and urine related. Contemporarily, there is current research that suggests garlic may help reduce the risk of some risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Garlic is one of the herbs, as Kathryn had mentioned, that is a pretty straight down the middle in terms of the growing conditions it prefers. It likes an average amount of water, and it does like to be in full sun. As the slide notes, you'll see the pinkish white blooms on the hardneck variety. There are 2 varieties of garlic, softneck and hardneck, and we don't have time in this presentation to go into all of the differences between them. But if you are planting garlic and looking for flowers in your garden, you do want to be sure that you plant the hardneck variety, because softneck variety does not have a bloom. If you plant the hardneck variety, you should get those showy blooms in April. So it's a nice early bloomer in your garden. As far as the part of the plant that is used both for cooking and was used for traditional medicinal purposes, it is the bulb, which is essentially the root of the plant. If you look at on the slide there's a photo that shows you the bulb. That's the larger part underground with the thin papery white covering all around it. And then the bulb is comprised of sections which are known as cloves. And so you can see there the bulb with one clove peeking out. Using the bulb for medicinal purposes is unique among garlic to the herbs being featured today. As far as planting, what is planted are those individual cloves or those sections of the bulb. It's recommended to plant garlic in the fall, usually 1 or 2 weeks after the first killing frost. And then you will harvest when the plant tops begin to die back, which is typically in late June to early July. And the way you harvest garlic is you simply dig it up and you have the bulb, and then you would break off and use those individual cloves for cooking or for traditional medicinal purposes. Garlic is a pretty low maintenance plant to maintain in your garden. One thing to be aware of is it does have a fragrant leaf. The leaf does have a garlicky smell, so that might be a pro or a con for you, I suppose, depending on how you feel about that aroma. That may dictate where in your garden you would want to put garlic. The hardneck variety of garlic, because it has that nice showy bloom, is a pollinator attractor. And garlic is also tolerant of deer, probably because of the aroma of the leaves. So that might also inform where in your garden you might want to put garlic. One thing that's important to note about purchasing garlic for planting purposes is that you do want to purchase preferably through a mail order nursery or at an organic market. And that's going to be true for the next 2 herbs we talk about as well. Garlic that you buy in the grocery store is probably 100% safe to consume, to use in your cooking purposes, but there can be some asymptomatic disease in garlic garden cloves. It's not a disease that would hurt you or me if ingested, but it is a disease that could hurt your garden. So the best way to avoid that is, again, we would recommend purchasing through a nursery, or possibly you could consider through an organic market. The next herb that we'll be talking about is turmeric. Turmeric is also something that you may be familiar with from cooking. Both it and the next herb are in the same family. It is the family Zingiberaceae, and in this family is turmeric, ginger, cardamom, which you also may be familiar with. The Latin name is Elateria cardamomum. And then a fourth herb that you may not be as familiar with, but that's very common in Southeast Asian cuisines, which is galangal. So turmeric is native to the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. And in fact, in traditional Hindu weddings, the groom ties a yellow string that's been tinted with turmeric around his wife's neck, and that signals her ability to watch over her household. For historical medicinal purposes, turmeric had many digestive uses. And in contemporary research, one study of 240 adults with pre-diabetes showed that taking it prevented them from getting diabetes. As far as growing turmeric, again, it's one of those herbs that likes its average amount of water and full sun. You should get a nice July bloom, like you can see in the photo, again, typically in July. And then the part of turmeric that is used is the rhizome, which you can see a photo of there on the slide. That is technically an underground stem, but you might think of it as a fleshy root. It is unique in the herbs we're presenting today to use the rhizome, both turmeric and ginger. Although turmeric does like full sun, it will do best in your garden if it has some shade in the afternoon. So if you can find a place where it has morning sun and then some afternoon shade. As far as harvesting turmeric, you are once again digging up the part underground of the plant and using that rhizome. That is also the edible part of the plant, or the part that is used for cooking. For planting purposes, you will then plant from a piece of that same rhizome. For planting purposes, you want to look for a piece of the rhizome that is firm, not shriveled, preferably several inches long, and you're looking for more than one bud or eye, like an eye on a potato, on the rhizome. You then will want to cut that into several pieces. Each piece should be about 2 or 3 inches long. You'll want each piece should have about 2 or 3 buds on it. That is the piece that you then plant in the earth. Moving on to ginger. Ginger is similar to turmeric. Again, it is in the same family, also originated in Southeast Asia, in the islands, and was likely domesticated first by the Austronesian peoples. Ginger has a very long tradition, both medicinally and in cooking purposes, in a wide variety of cultures. Many of us, probably our first exposure to ginger was through gingerbread. And you may be interested to know that legend has it that the very first gingerbread was made by a baker on the Isle of Rhodes near Greece around 2400 BC. As far as medicinal purposes, ginger is known as the universal medicine. In the Ayurvedic and Chinese cultures, it's an ingredient of half of the medicines in those cultures. In more contemporary research, there has been more than one clinical trial that has supported the short-term use of ginger for chemotherapy-associated nausea and vomiting and motion sickness. Now, ginger, as far as growing conditions, is a little bit different from some of the other herbs because it likes an average amount of water, but it really only likes partial sun. So you're going to want to find a part of your garden that's not overly sunny for ginger. You will get some blooms with ginger. Depending on how you plant and harvest your ginger, it will bloom seasonally, very similar to dandelion. So you can get an almost constant crop of ginger flowers in season if you get the right rotation going. Again, the part that is usually used both for cooking and for medicinal purposes is the rhizome, similar to turmeric. And there's a picture of a ginger rhizome there. You may be familiar with that from the grocery store. I would say that ginger is a medium maintenance herb, might require a little bit more effort in TLC than, for example, garlic. Again, harvesting and planting is going to be the same as for turmeric. Now turning to an herb you may not be as familiar with, which is roseroot. Roseroot is very well known in the Arctic cultures, the various cultures around the North Pole. And in fact, in mountain villages of Siberia, a bouquet of roseroots is still given to couples prior to marriage to enhance fertility and assure the birth of healthy children. Roseroot grows wild in that part of the world, and it was considered a very, very valuable herb. And in fact, certain families would pass down their tradition of where to gather the rose roots. They call them the golden roots, and the methods of extraction. Those traditions would pass down in particular families to particular family members, again, for generations and generations, hundreds, even 1,000 years. And then in the Siberian culture, they would then transport the herb, once it had been harvested, secretly down ancient secret trails to the Caucasian mountains, where it was traded for Georgian wines, fruits, garlic, and honey. So a very, very valued herb, largely used in for traditional medicinal purposes for respiratory functions. Now, both traditional use and contemporary research does indicate that there are mood and neurological benefits from roseroot. As far as growing conditions, roseroot is probably a nice challenge for some of you adventurous gardeners in this area, because it does like average water and full sun, but it's native to the crevices of mountain rocks, again, in those Arctic regions of Europe. So it likes rocks, and it does need a certain amount of cold to germinate. So trying to navigate that here, getting our nice full Virginia sun, but also keeping it cold enough, might be a nice project for an advanced gardener here. Under the right conditions, and roseroot has been grown in similar conditions to ours. It just may need more attention to do so. In the right conditions, you should get those nice blooms that you can see there in about May. The part of the roseroot, as the name suggests, that is used is the root, so similar to what Denise was talking about with marshmallow. As far as propagating and growing roseroot, it is recommended to store the seed in the refrigerator for up to 6 weeks. That will help speed the germination. And then once you have your roseroot in cultivation, you can collect those seeds every year, but you should be advised that it will take about 4 to 5 years for the roots or rhizomes to grow to a size that's large enough to be good for harvesting. And that also is true of the shoots. It's a slower growing plant. So again, a nice project for an adventurous or advanced gardener among you. Turning now to 2 herbs that are also ornamental flowers. The first is candy tuft. The name candy tuft, importantly, does not relate to candy. This is not a sweet tasting herb. It actually derives from Candia, which is the former name of Heraklion on the island of Crete. Candy tuft, in fact, is a member of the mustard family. In the Victorian era, there was a language of flowers. Each flower was assigned a particular meaning. And in the Victorian language of flowers, candy tuft symbolized indifference. So something to keep in mind, what message you may be receiving if someone hands you a bouquet of candy tuft flowers. But candy tuft also had some traditional medicinal uses. And the common theme between how it was used historically and what the contemporary research indicates seems to be digestive. Current research indicates that candy tuft can help with stomach acid, stomach and small intestine cramping, and diarrhea caused by IBS. Candy tuft is one of those herbs that likes the classic herb growing conditions, an average amount of water and a full amount of sun. It is important to note that candy tuft, if you want those nice big showy blooms like you have in this photo, you do need to give candy tuft plenty of sun. It will flower in the shade, but it will be much less floriferous. If you get it in the right conditions, you'll get those nice white blooms. It's an early bloomer, so April to May. And then as far as the part of the plant that was used for historical medicinal purposes, It was the seeds, so like elderberry that Denise was talking about, except elderberry had some other parts that you can use, and for candy tuft, medicinally, it's really just the seeds. You also, of course, can harvest the flowers as cut flowers if you would like. For propagation purposes, it is recommended to start the seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks before the end of frost season. And then you will harvest the seeds, if that's what you're harvesting, when they are fully ripe, which is when the seed pods begin to dry out on the plant. Next is hollyhock. Hollyhock is native to China, but its origin is somewhat obscure. It's probably a hybrid. It has been widely cultivated for a long time. Another flower that had meaning in the Victorian era, the hollyhock symbolized ambition, fecundity or fertility, honesty, and fascination. It also has historical medicinal uses with pretty much an ear, nose, throat theme. Hollyhocks were used to soothe the mucous membrane. They were used to treat coughs, colds, and bronchitis. They also were used as an anti-arthritic medicine, so to treat and prevent arthritis. Current research suggests that hollyhock can work like estrogen to provoke and regulate menstrual cycles. This is another herb that likes the classic herb growing conditions of an average amount of water and full sun. For best results for growing purposes, it is recommended to sow seeds immediately on a good soil-based compost. And then for medicinal purposes, the part that was most commonly used is the flower, similar to how Denise talked about calendula. You should get blooms in June. It's a late spring, early summer bloomer. And then if you're going to collect the flowers for medicinal purposes, they should be gathered when they're in full bloom, which is typically July, early August. And then you will want to immediately dry them. Dry them in trays, in thin layers, in a current of warm air, immediately after picking. And then finally, we have the house leek, which is another one you may or may not be as familiar with. It is also known as hens and chickens. That Latin name there, sempervivum tectorum, it means always green, sempervivum, and then tectorum means of house roofs. And hens and chicks grows naturally on thatch roofs, and it's also planted on thatch roofs to give that very picturesque quality we associate with those houses. And that tradition of having house leek or hens and chicks on house roofs goes back into ancient times. In fact, there was a Roman tradition that claimed that it protected buildings against lightning strikes. As far as historical medicinal uses, the leaves from house leek were put in poultices for skin ulcers and in ointments, very similar to aloe vera. It is a succulent. And current contemporary uses would also be very similar to aloe vera. Because house leek is evergreen and a succulent, it likes full sun, but it does like to be dry. So house leek needs to be somewhere where it's not going to get too moist. Typically, it will bloom in June. That bloom there in the middle of the picture is the hen. You may or may not consider that the most beautiful part of the plant, but that is the bloom and the hen. As far as harvesting, again, you're harvesting the leaves. So similar to what Denise was talking about with, for example, thyme, except with house leek, you're expressing the juice from the leaves as opposed to using the fiber of the leaves. House leek is a nice, pretty friendly plant to grow in your garden in that it does grow in average soils. It's relatively easy to propagate. You can grow it from seed. You can also grow it from seedlings, or you can divide the offsets. All those little chicks around the hen there are offsets, and you can divide those and replant them. As far as harvesting, because it's an evergreen at any time, if you need the juice, you simply go out, break off a leaf, and squeeze out the juice. Again, very, very similar to aloe vera. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Susan, who's going to give us some master gardening tips in general.
Thank you, Amanda. Earlier in this presentation, Kathryn introduced our featured herbs organized by preferred growing conditions. Denise and Amanda have described these herbs in more detail and explained which parts are used for historical medicinal purposes. This chart summarizes our featured herbs based on which part is most often used for historical medicinal purposes, be it roots, leaves, flowers, or bulbs. It also gives you the approximate flowering time, as for some herbs, flowering time is related to harvest time. Before moving on to the next portion of the presentation, let's talk more about how to preserve herbs. As Amanda and Denise have explained, several of our featured herbs, such as thyme and calendula, are best preserved by drying. There are several techniques for drying herbs. The simplest method is to tie herb stems together in small bunches and hang the bunches upside down from a rod or rafter in a dark, dry, well-ventilated place. The bunches should not touch so that air can freely circulate around them. Similarly, you can also place the stems and leaves on wire screen in a dry, dark, well-ventilated location. In either case, be sure to label the herbs because it is difficult to recognize herb leaves once they are dried. Herbs may be dried in a gas oven at a very low temperature, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Electric ovens usually cannot be set at this temperature. Strip the leaves from the stems and place them in a single layer on a wide flat sheet or pan. Place the pan in the oven with the door ajar. Stir herbs gently every 30 minutes, and the herbs should dry sufficiently in about 3 to 5 hours. Another option is to dry herbs in a microwave oven. The preferred method is to put the herb leaves in between paper towels. Microwave about 1 minute on low. If the herbs are not dry, microwave several seconds more. Herbs will burn quickly in the microwave and volatile oils may spark. Sparking, like browning of the leaves, indicates overprocessing. Herbs dried in the microwave should retain a green color. Lastly, you can use a dehydrator. If using a dehydrator, follow the manufacturer's directions. The Virginia Tech publication, Herb Culture and Use, has specific instructions for how to determine if your herbs are truly dried before storing them. This is important as herbs that are not sufficiently dry will mold in their storage containers. As Amanda pointed out when talking about ginger and turmeric, herbs can also be frozen. Frozen herbs will not look the same as fresh herbs, but they will taste the same. Freezing is also the best way to preserve the herb's nutrients. Because freezing instructions vary by herb, please check site:/edu or site:/gov resources for additional information. Now let's talk about how to grow medicinal herbs. You'll be much more likely to grow your herbs successfully if you match the herb to the growing conditions it prefers. Master gardeners refer to this as right plant, right place. Most of our featured herbs require full sun to grow successfully. This means they should be planted in a location that receives 6 to 8 hours of sun daily. Soil conditions are also important. If you'll be planting in the ground, get your soil tested before planting. The soil test will let you know your soil pH, that is how acidic or sweet the soil is, and any nutritional deficiencies that should be addressed before planting. Directions for taking and submitting soil tests are available on the Virginia Tech website. Additionally, because of our heavy soil, most Northern Virginia gardeners creating new garden beds will need to add compost or other organic materials to the soil to improve soil texture and drainage. Also, be sure to plant your herbs at the appropriate time. For example, as Denise mentioned, calendula can struggle in high temperatures, so you want to get it in the ground as early in the spring as possible. Or if planting at a later time, be aware that calendula may not thrive until the cooler temperatures of fall. Finally, when selecting a planting location, keep in mind that herbs can be planted in their own beds, but they don't have to be. You can interplant herbs with vegetables in your vegetable garden if you have one, or among flowers, shrubs, and trees in mixed plantings. Now let's talk about what to look for when purchasing plants. When purchasing plants, make sure the plant is what you think it is. Look for Latin names to be sure you are getting the plant you want. Select plants that are free of insects and that look healthy, because it is difficult to impossible to improve plant quality. Also look to see if numerous roots are growing out of the bottom of the pot. That may be a sign that the plant is root bound. You can also tell if a plant is root bound by sliding the plant out of its container. If you see large roots growing around the outside of the root ball, the plant is root bound, and this could impact the plant's future growth if not properly addressed. There are steps you can take to compensate for this condition, but it's easier to just avoid buying a plant that is not root bound if at all possible. I'm sorry, avoiding a plant that is root bound, avoiding a plant that is root bound if possible. Once you have your plants, you need to get them ready to put in the ground or the container where they're going to be growing. They need to be gradually exposed to the outdoor conditions in which they will be growing, including wind, sun, and temperature. This process is called hardening off. One way to do this is to place the plants outside in a shady location. Gradually increase the amount of time the plant is outdoors and the amount of sun it receives until you are leaving it out all day or even overnight by the end of the hardening off period. After about 7 to 10 days, the plant should be ready to be put in the ground or container. Once the plants are hardened off, transplant them into the garden on an overcast day. Loosen the soil around the root ball and place the transplants in the ground so that the top of the soil ball of the transplant is level with the surrounding soil. Top dress with compost or other organic material such as leaf mulch. Be sure to space the plants properly to allow for the full-size growth, and water well. In contrast to what we will be talking about in a few minutes, recent transplants need frequent light watering to accommodate their shallow young roots and to ease the shock of being pulled from their planting containers. Now we'll talk about container planting. When transplanting to a container, make sure the container is large enough. The most common mistake new gardeners make is to put plants in containers that are too small. At maturity, herbs have root systems a little larger than their top growth. Therefore, it is important to choose a container large enough to allow space for roots to grow. Also, make sure your pots are clean. If you're reusing a pot, wash it with a mixture of water and bleach, 9 parts water to 1 part bleach. This will disinfect the pots and remove any salts around the edges of the pot. Place a coffee filter or wipe in the bottom of the pot to keep the dirt from falling out. Do not put gravel or rocks in the bottom of your container. Contrary to what some may think, gravel and rock in the bottom of a container does not promote good drainage. Moisten your potting soil and add it to the container until the top of the soil is 1 to 2 inches below the inch of the container. This will help facilitate later watering. As with planting in the ground, loosen the root ball and place the plant so the top of the soil ball is at the same level as the potting soil in the container. Another important factor in successful herb growing is the correct watering. Know your herbs and how much water they require. For example, sage needs little water, while elderberry prefers moist conditions. If you are not sure if the plant needs water, stick your finger about 1 inch in the pot or the ground. If the soil feels dry, that's a sign usually that you need to water. The best time to water in the morning is in the morning so that any moisture on the plants can dry off before evening. As I mentioned earlier, proper watering is especially critical the first few weeks after transplanting. However, once the plants are established, a thorough watering with a period of drying is better than frequent light waterings. If you will be growing herbs in pots, keep in mind that plants in pots will generally dry out faster than plants in the ground. And root-bound plants in pots will also dry out faster than other plants in pots. When thinking about fertilizer, you need to research the nutritional needs of the herbs you are planting and use that information, along with the results of your soil test, to determine whether fertilizer is needed, and if so, when and how to apply it. For example, herbs such as thyme and sage do well in poor to average soil and may not need fertilizer. Ginger, on the other hand, benefits from the application of a balanced, slow-release fertilizer at the time of planting and requires additional nitrogen throughout the growing season. Elderberry benefits from adding composted manure to the soil when planting and from a top dressing of compost every year or two. If fertilizer is needed, use a slow-release organic fertilizer and water well between applications. If you are growing herbs in pots, keep in mind that your potting soil may already have fertilizer in it. Be especially careful when adding fertilizers to containers of plants, as too much can be toxic. Once your plants are in the ground or the container, make it a habit to check them daily or as often as you can to make sure they're okay. When checking your plants, be sure to look under a few leaves to see if any bugs are hiding or for signs of disease on the back side of leaves. The best defense against pests is preventative cultural management, such as the removal of weak or infested growth. If you see any signs of bugs or damage that might be caused by a disease, the first step is to identify the problem, and for bugs, to check to see if the bug is harmful or beneficial. There are many online resources that can help you do this. You can also take a picture of the bug or leaf damage and send it to the help desk for assistance in identification. Kathryn gave you that email address earlier in the presentation, and we'll revisit it at the end. Depending on the problem, if the damage is not too serious, you may want to just live with it. Virginia Tech's Pest Management Guide, available online, provides a range of treatments to common problems you may run into, starting with the least invasive approach. For example, the most common disease of Althea rosea, or hollyhocks in Virginia, is fungal rust. It shows up as brown pustules about the size of a pinhead on the undersides of lower leaves during the later part of May. Cultural controls include removing the first rusted leaves in spring as soon as symptoms are observed, cutting down and removing old plants as soon as flowering is over, and carefully cleaning up fallen plant debris. Fortunately, rust does not harm the hollyhock flowers. Do not spray with harmful pesticides if you plan on ingesting any part of your herbs. The steps we have been talking about today are what master gardeners refer to as best practices. To reiterate, if planting in the ground, check your soil to learn the pH and nutrients available. Add organic matter to improve drainage and aeration. Whether planting in the ground or the pot or in pots, match the plants you want to grow with the growing conditions they prefer. Water properly, especially after initial transplanting. And practice environmental stewardship by allowing some herbs to flower to support beneficial insects as part of a naturally balanced ecosystem, and by managing pests and pathogens using the most natural, least toxic methods to achieve acceptable outcomes. As Kathryn mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the Virginia Cooperative Extension Service and the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia have many resources available to help you grow herbs successfully. Feel free to contact the help desk at margalex@gmail.com. That's MGARLALEX@gmail.com with your questions. Also check out the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website at mgnv.org, where among other resources, you can subscribe to a quarterly herb update with seasonal planting and care instructions. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for joining us, and happy gardening.